Okay, guys, welcome to your final lecture for the ecology unit, where we will discuss a couple different ideas, actually. So I have to start this lecture by saying I know that some of the past lectures have been cutting off my words right at the very end because I'm pushing to try to get everything in 15 minutes. So in order to not fly through this material way too quickly, this is actually going to be split up into two lectures. So the first lecture that you're going to watch now is about the first half of this kind of weekly topic. We're going to discuss strictly how energy flows through the level of an ecosystem. Then in the second lecture, we're going to talk more about the cycling of matter. But it's important that from the get-go you understand that we're talking about two very, very, very different things. Number one, the flow of energy, and number two, the cycling of matter. So I'll talk more about those things as we get kind of deeper into these different lectures, but just understand that right from the get-go we're going to split those things up. So let's start with, like I said, talking about how energy flows through the level of an ecosystem. So you've heard me now a couple times say the word ecosystem, so please keep in mind that means that we are no longer talking about populations of single species living in the same area. We're no longer talking about communities, multiple different species living and interacting together. We are now talking about the level of an ecosystem, which means not only do we have living components, but we're also bringing in the non-living, or as you now know are called the abiotic components of the environment. So we have biotic and abiotic factors to an environment now kind of interacting with one another. So right here, what you're looking at is a very, very important picture that sets the stage for what we're going to be talking about over the course of the next two lectures. On the one hand, you see this input of energy from solar energy, in other words, the sun. And on the other hand, and well, I should say that the yellow arrows represent energy here. So you have the energy coming in from the sun, and then you have this energy here and in multiple other places kind of leaving this flow as heat. But you also have these red arrows that are making a cycle, and that's what we're going to talk about in the second half of the lecture, the cycling of nutrients, or the cycling of stuff, of matter. Right now we're just going to focus on these yellow arrows, the flow of energy. So a couple things that you need to know right here from this initial diagram. Number one, energy enters an ecosystem usually as solar energy from sunlight. Most ecosystems on our planet are based on organisms obtaining inorganic energy from the sun and turning it into organic energy, or energy that living organisms can use, through a process known as photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is just an organism taking sunlight and making usable organic forms of energy that other life forms can use. However, sunlight is not the only form of energy that can be input into an ecosystem. Some ecosystems thrive based on a source of chemical energy, and those are typically found at the bottom of the ocean. And organisms there are huddled around geothermal vents, and they're using inorganic forms of energy, not as sunlight, but as sulfur that bubbles up from underneath the earth, and they are converting that inorganic source of energy into organic forms of energy. So most ecosystems rely on photosynthesis. An ecosystem like that relies on a process known as chemosynthesis. In either case, we're talking about turning an inorganic, unusable form of energy for life forms into an organic, usable form of energy. This diagram right here also has a couple important vocabulary terms that you need to know right off the bat. So first, let's talk about this one right here. When we have solar energy starting from the sun and coming into an ecosystem represented by that yellow arrow, it is first meant by what we call producers. Another word for a producer is an autotroph. Producers, or autotrophs, are defined as organisms that are able to take inorganic forms of energy, like sunlight, and convert it into organic forms of energy, either using photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. So essentially, producers, or autotrophs, either way they kind of mean the same thing, are able to produce their own source of energy. Okay? So producers are incredibly, incredibly important because they're the ones that are harvesting the inorganic energy from outside the ecosystem, and they're actually bringing it into a living form, an organic form of energy that other organisms can now start to use. Typically we're talking about plants because plants can do photosynthesis, but sometimes, like I said, we're talking about organisms at the bottom of the ocean doing chemosynthesis using inorganic chemicals from underneath our planet instead of sunlight. Now, what happens to all that energy is it gets passed from these producers onto what we call consumers. Another word for a consumer is a heterotroph. So an autotroph, the term autotroph literally means self-feeding. Auto means self, troph means to eat or to feed. Okay? Consumers, on the other hand, can be called heterotrophs. Hetero is a word that means other, and again, troph means to eat or to feed. So heterotrophs are organisms that need to consume, which is why they're also called consumers, other organisms in order to obtain their energy. They cannot get energy for themselves. They have to consume something else in order to do so. Okay? So that's typically where we're talking about our insects and our animals and things that we're familiar with that aren't, plants and algae and things like that. Okay, so you need to know about autotrophs. You need to know about the fact that they're also called producers, and consumers, which are also called heterotrophs. Now we also have kind of this section over here, a section called decomposers. Decomposers are absolutely critical, as you learned this weekend from watching, or at least some of you did from watching one of the videos that was assigned. Decomposers are organisms that actually take dead, dying organic matter, and they kind of take the nutrients, the carbon and the nitrogen and various forms of matter that are locked inside of those dead and decaying organisms, and they recycle those nutrients back to the ecosystem. So decomposers are an essential part of this kind of chain, as well as the producers, which harvest the energy, consumers, which need to eat other things in order to get that energy. Decomposers help return what's left of these formerly living organisms back to the environment. Now, notice what they're returning, though, is this red arrow. It's nutrients. That's what we're going to talk about in our second part of the lecture. One thing that is not ever returned or recycled in an ecosystem, this is so important for you guys to understand, is this initial energy. Okay? Energy moves through an ecosystem in what we call a unidirectional path, meaning it enters in one way, and that energy actually leaves an ecosystem. In this case, they're showing energy leaving the ecosystem as heat. But organisms also use that energy for movement. They use that energy for reproduction. They use that energy to breathe. Organisms are constantly using that energy. The important thing here is it's not being recycled. Energy cannot be recycled. That's why this lesson is called the energy flow, because energy flows one way through an ecosystem. Okay? So producers take that energy in, consumers need to eat other things in order to obtain that energy, decomposers help return other things to the ecosystem, but energy is one thing that cannot be returned. It flows one way through any and all ecosystems on our planet. So now we'll talk about kind of some other vocabulary terms you need to be familiar with. Since you now know what a producer is, and a producer is something, again, that can produce its own energy using inorganic energy like sun or chemicals from deep within the earth. And usually we think of producers as plants. That's the most common example that we have, because plants can perform photosynthesis and turn that energy from the sun into usable energy for other life forms. So at the bottom of most ecosystems, we have these producers, these organisms that can take energy from one form and make it into a form that's usable for other organisms. Those other organisms that need that energy are called consumers. They have to consume something in order to obtain their energy, but there are different levels of consumers. The first level is known as a primary consumer. The second level is called a secondary consumer. The third level is called a tertiary consumer. And you can go on and on and on, and I can't, because I run out of things to say, past quaternary. I don't know what the fifth level consumer is called, but here we have primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary consumers. These are all organisms that need to eat other organisms in order to obtain their energy. The word that comes before consumer, whether it's primary, secondary, tertiary, or quaternary, that just describes where that organism fits within its ecosystem. So a primary consumer is always defined as something that eats a producer. Primary consumers, by definition, eat producers. Secondary consumers, by definition, eat primary consumers. Tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers, and quaternary consumers eat tertiary consumers. Now, This can all change depending upon how you have the feeding relationship set up. And you'll see examples of that in class, but just because something is a primary consumer in one example doesn't mean it couldn't be a secondary consumer in another example. Okay? You'll see some details about that as we get into class. For right now, you just need to know there are different levels of consumers based upon what they eat at the level below them. And here we have an example of what we'll be working with for a majority of the rest of the week. This is what we call a food web. And a food web simply shows the feeding relationships among the various organisms within an ecosystem. A food chain is something you might be a little bit more familiar with. A food chain is a single pathway. So let's just make a food chain here, for example. Let's say we go from the maple tree leaves up to the cricket. And we're going to go from the cricket, oh, that's a long arrow and it's terrible, sorry, over here to the robin, and then the robin is going to get eaten by the fox. That single pathway, guys, would be a food chain. And it shows one organism eating another organism in just kind of one single line. Okay? This whole picture represents then what's called a food web. So a food web is just a whole bunch of food chains kind of interconnected, showing lots of different feeding relationships throughout an entire ecosystem. A food web is much more complex. Now, what you need to know about a food web is this information right here. This is incredibly important what this paragraph says. Arrows show direction of energy, and here's that word again, flow. One-way energy flow from organism consumed to the consumer. So these arrows point the direction they do for a very specific reason. They are pointing the direction that energy is flowing. So for example, energy is leaving this rotting log and flowing into this bracket fungus. So the fungus is obtaining energy from the rotting log. Super important that you understand that those arrows show the direction in which energy moves in a food web. And then the final thing we'll address in this lecture are known as ecological pyramids. And there's lots of different examples of ecological pyramids, but essentially they all do the same thing. They all show either the relationship of the different levels of organisms within an ecosystem. So here's our tertiary, secondary, primary consumers, and then we have down here our producers at the base level. They either show the relationship between those things in terms of how much there are, how many of those organisms there are, how much they weigh, or what we call biomass, which is just, again, another measurement of how many there are. But this particular pyramid is something you need to get very familiar with. This particular pyramid shows a relationship of energy. And it shows something critical known as the rule of 10. Okay. Now notice this doesn't look like a pyramid you would typically be familiar with, like an Egyptian pyramid or something like that. It's kind of more blocky, and each block is significantly smaller than the blocks before it. So what's happening in this pyramid is it's showing how much energy is being passed from one level of the ecosystem on to the next. We can see that relationship in a food web with arrows, but we don't get a sense for the quantity, the amount of energy that's moving on as those various organisms are feeding on each other. Okay? So the rule of 10 states that at one level of the ecosystem, so say down here we have an example of 1 million joules. This J just stands for joule, and it's a measurement of energy. So say we have 1 million joules of sunlight coming into this ecosystem. The rule of 10 says only 10% of that energy actually moves on to the next level of the ecosystem. Okay? Only 10%. So essentially what we've done, you'll notice, is we have lopped off this 0 right here to get to this level. And then when this, for example, this grasshopper eats this flower, so we have energy going from the flower into the grasshopper. We started with 10,000 joules now, and now we've gone down to 1,000. So again, we've completely gotten rid of one of these zeros. We've decreased by, we only have 10% left, I guess is what I should say. Okay. Then when energy goes from this grasshopper to this mouse, again, we lose one of our zeros, and now we only have 100 joules of energy. Okay. And then at the very top here with this top level consumer, this snake, he's only getting 10 joules of energy when there was 1 million to start with. Okay. So this explains why we don't see tons and tons and tons of, for example, snakes like we see tons and tons and tons of flowers, because there's simply not enough energy at these top levels of the ecosystem thanks to the rule of 10. Energy flows one way through an ecosystem and then